Welcome to Learning Aloud, a podcast from the Organizational Dynamics community at the University of Pennsylvania, produced to inspire purposeful leadership practice and transform organizational experience. I am your host, Stephen G. Hart. Liz Nilsen is a Senior Program Director of the Purdue Agile Strategy Lab. She's also a co-author with Ed Morrison, Scott Hutcheson, Janyce Fadden, and Nancy Franklin of the book Strategic Doing, 10 Skills for Agile Leadership. The book identifies 10 leadership skills and practices that anyone can learn to help them navigate or lead transformation and change in today's complex and turbulent world. The 10 skills are listed in the show notes for this podcast. In this session, Liz was a guest speaker in the class I teach with Wayne Tarkin, titled Developing the Agile Leader and Their Organization. Liz's visit coincided with our completing the reading of the book and following several weeks of posting about it in the discussion section of our Canvas site. Liz shares with us how the book came about and the lessons and experiences that inspired it. She also unexpectedly gave our students some impromptu coaching tips for writing a compelling framing question, which is skill number 2 in the book. I hope you enjoy listening to our conversation. Liz, welcome so much. It's great to see you here and appreciate all you've done to help our course this year with your great book and your co-writers of Strategic Doing. Let's start with that, perhaps. Can you tell us a little bit about how that book came about?
Sure. It actually came about as part of a strategic doing workshop that we did. So you all read the book and sort of learned the 10 skills. And the genesis of the book is actually a process that we do when we put all 10 together. And we were with a group of colleagues, about 10 of us, and we were talking about imagine if strategic doing were known as one of the premier strategy tools for management. What would that look like? That was our framing question. And one of the ideas that came out of that was, there was a lot of ideas, but one of them was we could write a book. And when we talked about what the big easy was, that actually turned out to be the big easy, even though it certainly seemed pretty big and not so easy. But at any rate, it was better than the other choices. And so it actually started as a big easy that then we, our starting project for that was, okay, let's write an outline. And then we just kept going and we ended up with a book.
So when we chatted a bit yesterday, we asked you what it was like to work with 4 other authors. So, and whether or not you used Agile principles in the writing of the book.
So we did. Yeah. I mean, the genesis of the book was definitely based on those. And then we wrote the book in a series of writing retreats where we all got together. We got an Airbnb for, 3 days or so. And we would, organized rather than doing 30/30s or 7/7s. We did 4 hours. So we'd get up in the morning, talk about what we needed to happen in the next 4 hours. Everybody would say, I'm going to do this. It'll be done by noon. And we'd go away and write for 4 hours. We'd come back, sort of share what we'd each done, have a break for lunch, and then come back and say, okay, did what we just did change anything that we need to do next? Yes, no, okay, let's go for another 4 hours. And we did, I think, 3 of those 3-day sprints essentially, and we had to do a fair amount of editing afterwards, but we essentially had a book at the end of all of that. So
fantastic. Now, Jean, I know you had a question that you would like to ask our guest.
I do, please, Liz. In the book, you talk about the skills linking. So there was a mention made that skills 3, 4, and 5 people tend to show trends and be successful with those skills. And skills 8, 9, and 10. Those were linked together. Could you explain a little bit and help us understand how those skill sets link together? And Sure. What have you been observing as far as traits and behaviors go with the skills?
So I'll start with the first set, 3, 4, and 5, particularly 3 and 4. So people who are sort of naturally gifted at 3 and 4 tend to be the kinds of people who like generating lots of ideas, tend to be the kind of people who make good entrepreneurs, not always, but tend to be. So that the people just kind of generate lots of ideas. So one of my colleagues, Ed, who's the person who developed strategic doing originally, he is definitely a rule 3 and 4 guy. He will spit out new ideas all day long. I, on the other hand, am much more a, rules 6, 7, 8, let's say, someone's got a good idea like Ed, and someone else will say, okay, let's kind of do a little experiment on it. And I will say, okay, now how do we scale up that experiment into something bigger? How do we make it a system? How do we surround it with a structure that helps us support it over the long haul? So that also kind of maps to the S curve. If you think about, how ideas and trends go, that the idea part is kind of down here at the bottom and you work your way up to the top of the S curve. People don't always fall exactly along that line, but they tend to. And it's definitely something we've observed. And our colleagues in Holland at Human Insight have actually designed a instrument that helps kind of get at some of that. That was long before we ever met them, but when we saw what they were doing, we was like, okay, this actually sort of measures what it is we've observed
measurement, physical measurements, measurement questionnaire. You say
it's a questionnaire measurement. It's an online
validated questionnaire.
Yeah. It's called the AEM Cube.
Okay. Thank you. My camera keeps going off. Sorry, I'm here. I don't know why. Okay.
All right, Brigitte, you have a follow-up question, and then we'll hear from Larry.
Yes. Hi, Liz. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Jean's comments parlay really well into one of my best learnings from reading the book is this idea that you should never attempt to be all 10 skill, like excel at all 10 skills, right? I think that's a huge misconception
right. Yeah.
Of leaders in a non-agile environment. How would you recommend, or if you've ever encountered a leader who believes that they should be good at all 10, how do you tackle that situation? How do you get them to embrace that they should never try to be the best at all 10, but that when everybody comes to their room with their best self and their best assets, the team and the global good is better off?
Yeah, it's definitely true that nobody is good at all 10. I mean, what I like to say is that everybody can get better at all 10, but some of them will always be like writing with the hand that you don't usually write with. Like I can do rules 3 and 4, skills 3 and 4, linking and leveraging. I'm not great at it. When Ed does it, it's magic happens. And I think, well, I can do it, but it feels a little mechanical. I think for a lot of these things, what we've observed is that for most people, it's learned behavior that makes them behave in ways that maybe aren't that helpful. And this is one, I think, where people feel like they have to carry the ball, that if they don't carry the ball, nobody else is going to. And maybe they're going to get blamed for it. And so I think it really starts kind of with skill 1, creating an atmosphere in which everybody feels psychologically safe so that person can say, I don't have to do everything. What can we do together? But I think you have to start there, because I think otherwise you run headlong, I think, into people's insecurities about what it is they're supposed to be able to do. And I think that's a recipe for, people doing things that they're not so good at. But I think most people, if you can get them in a situation where they have an experience of a colleague doing something that, like I do with my colleague Ed, like, wow, Ed, how do you do that? When I see him do it, I think, why in the world would I take that from him? Because he's so much better at it than I am.
Good. Larry, your questions.
Thank you.
I have 2, Liz. One is, why are there only 10? And is it because of the people that had reservations in the Airbnb? And 2, how did you come across and develop the credo and the challenges that were involved in that?
Sure. Yeah, both really good questions. I'll speak to the first one first, the 10. So, originally there weren't 10. Originally, there were just the 4 questions. What could we do? What should we do? What will we do? What's our 30-30? And we were training people in those. And then when my colleague Scott said, I think there's these other things underneath the 4. Let's dig into that. And that's where the 10 came from. I suppose we could have decided there were 12, but 10 seemed right when we thought about the groups that we'd worked with and how the process kind of worked out. The credo came about, so we have a national group of leaders who think about sort of where's strategic going. There's about 10 of us. And it's in the book and I can't remember when. I want to say 2011, that group was together at a state park. And a member of the state park, the group at the state park said, I'd like to spend some time thinking about why we do what we do. And the credo came out of that. but I want to, because some of you may be thinking, wait a minute, that sounds a lot like a vision statement. And didn't they just say you shouldn't have a vision statement? We didn't spend a whole lot of time constructing it. I actually wasn't at that gathering. They didn't spend a whole lot of time constructing it. And I don't know that they knew it would sort of live beyond that particular meeting. It has. And we use it, almost every time we're with a group. We sort of say, right at the outset, here's why we do strategic doing. Here's why we think it's important.
Has it been revised, or has it sort of lived the life that it had at the beginning?
Yeah, it's lived. Yeah, it has stayed, I think, unedited since that first one. So far, it's served us pretty well.
Thank you. Wayne, you have a question.
Yes, whenever I read a book like yours, I do take a lot of notes. I write things down to kind of remember, because I love the information. I want to just kind of retain it and spell it out and use it all the time. And I think there was reference of someone on your team actually would write the questions on their door, and so that when you talk to people, you'd have that in front of you. Now I don't see anything on the door behind you, but I still think that might have been you who did that. Can you solve that mystery for us?
Yeah, that's someone on our team. It's so Christy Bell. She's at the University of Alaska, and she just has the 4 questions written on a piece of paper on the back of her door. And when she's on the telephone, this is where it came from. That when she was on the telephone, she would sort of look at it and say, "Am I talking about one of these questions? Because if I'm not, this isn't a strategic conversation that's worth a lot of my time."
Yeah. So there's a new product, maybe a door.
We actually have a door hanger we hand out at trainings that, yeah.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
It looks like one of those hotel things that tells the maid to go away kind of thing, right? Yeah.
Ryan, you have a question.
Thanks, Steve. Liz, I'm really excited you're here because as I've been reading through the book, I've been trying to implement all 10 of these steps in this. It's kind of like my own agile sandbox. I've created a culture and engagement team, which I think is like the perfect opportunity to bring people in and get their ideas and get customer feedback, internal customer feedback, adjust and kind of go through everything. And as I'm looking at this, I eventually want to morph that agile culture and engagement team into an emerging leaders program. Right. Yeah. So I'm looking at these 10 steps and I'm wondering, have you guys built out training modules on them? Like what if because I'm responsible for learning and development at Leo Pharma. If I wanted to build out a strategic a training curriculum based on strategic doing, like what thoughts do you have? Like that process?
We actually do have an online course on the 10 skills and on the book, and we have a workbook we designed to go with the book. So I'd love to have that conversation with you. So I put my contact info in the chat.
Great.
Yeah.
That's very efficient for me too.
Yeah. And we've done a fair amount of work with leadership programs because, many of them feel like that sort of this traditional tools for training leaders are a little bit tired and are looking for something new. So
great. Thank you so much.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about how you have gone into sort of teaching this and helping organizations to experience strategic doing. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution and how you went from the book into then teaching it to other people and how it's gone?
Sure. It actually happened the other way around. So Ed Morrison, who's our director, who is the person who originally designed strategic doing, he started life out as a consultant and he'd worked with lots of groups and decided he'd sort of gotten to this point where he didn't want to just build a big consulting firm, but he did want lots of people kind of using strategic doing with different groups. And so he went to a university because he figured that's where he could learn how to teach strategic doing. And he tells a story. He figured that would be, a couple of years. And that was, I think, 12 years ago. But what came out of that time was originally a 2.5-day in-person training that we did with individuals and groups. The first day and a half of that really is learning the 10 skills, or in the training, we call them the 10 rules. And then the last day is how do you put those things together into a team process? So that came first, actually. And then there was the discussion about what would it look like if strategic doing were a well-known management tool? And the book came out of that. So actually the training came first. And then after we had the book, we said, okay, if we just wanted to teach the 10 skills based on the book, could we design a course around that? And we designed a workbook to go along with that. So it's a little bit backwards maybe from the way we could have thought about doing it, but that's what's happened. So.
Well, all right, Brigitte, you have another question.
It's a follow-up to both of the last two questions. Who is the ideal attendee? Because I think that part of what we read in our other textbook is this notion that Agile isn't for everybody. And if you aren't open to it, or if you don't fundamentally understand your innate goals, then these 10 rules or the Agile methodology really will fall on deaf ears. And so who is your ideal attendee in your training?
I would definitely say that's true. So sometimes when we do a class, it's kind of open enrollment. It's anybody who wants to register. And sometimes an organization or company will call and say, hey, we would like to train 15 of our people. And when we do the latter, we see really clearly the people who were forced to be there and the people who weren't. That the people who are forced to be there, they'll go through the motions, but you can tell, it's just not something they're interested in doing. So I think it is definitely a kind of a coalition of the willing. It has to be. But beyond that, we've had, some of the people that we've trained that have been the most successful using the skills have been graduate students. So we trained a bunch at Purdue. They originally came because they wanted to change their student government association. But then it turned out they were so good at it, we used them when we were doing workshops with companies. We'd say, hey, we need a couple extra people. Can you come? And the grad students turned out to be great at it. But we've had CEOs who, with the right mindset, are absolutely the right people. A lot of my work has been in higher education. And that can be a mixed bag because, there's some higher education is a tough place to make change happen. And there's some people who want to make it happen and some people who actually want to make it not happen. Those are not the right people. So we've seen, I think, everything, at every kind of level of the organization and in just about every sector. But it really is kind of do you want to do things differently? I often start trainings, I'll say, how many of you have been on a strategic planning group? Most of the hands go up because, one way or another, you've been on a strategic planning group. And then I'll say, well, how many of you enjoyed it? And all the hands go down. I'm like, okay, you're the right people. This is for the people who are sick of doing that because they're sick of creating a nice book that landed on their bookshelf.
Yeah.
It's a good anecdote. Yeah.
Wayne, you have another question?
Yeah, one of the things that we spend most of our time on in this class so far has been the framing question, right? We've had 4 student groups, so each of them has a different story to tell. We had 13 individuals; each of them has a story to tell. So it's been a little frustrating at times, because it's hard to pin people down, right? Because sometimes they don't even know what they want. And we've had some big organizations and I guess there's no really shortcuts, but do you have any techniques that you've developed that you can drill down and get the essential framing question earlier than later?
I've got a couple. So first I want to say, I warned when Steve, I do this, I would be really interested in, if you could put in the chat, what do you think your organization's framing question should be? I'd just be really interested in hearing from all of you while I'm talking about this. It can take a long time. And what we tell groups is it should take as long as it takes, because it's so important that it is worth taking however much time you need to do it. But there are a couple tricks, I think. One is that the power is in the adjectives and the verbs. So if you have a question that feels just kind of that's the first place to look is, do you have boring adjectives and verbs? Or often you don't have any adjectives, and you can put one in. But that's one way. Another trick is to what we call flip the question. So often we write a question that has to do with us as an organization. Imagine if we did this, what would that look like? And if we flip it to say, what if our customers had this experience? What would that look like? And sometimes that's a much better question to ask and much more engaging. Short is always better, and it creates better questions. So I usually say 25 words. That's hard. but that means that you cut out all the words that aren't very good. But this is one that we're definitely, you can get better at it, but some people are just naturally good at it. And it's just is fun to watch them work because it's just their brain just kind of, it's right in that channel. And if you find one of those people, like maybe you've discovered someone in this class who's really good at it, don't lose their email.
Yeah. No, students, don't worry about it. We're not going to ask you to do yours in 25 words.
No. I don't see any on here. Come on, folks.
26 maybe, but no.
Suresh, you have a question.
Hi, yeah. So one of the things I'm really passionate about is probably like accessible education. So, for example, if a high school was to try to experiment in teaching leadership kind of at like a younger age, how would you go about implementing the lessons in strategic doing? And do you think it would be suitable for people at that age group at 17 or 18, or do you think it's something that you really need experience to understand?
No, it's definitely. So so for people who have taken our training, we have a follow-on certification course. And one of the people in the certification course that just finished, she did a project with a group of high school students around meaningful STEM experiences for high schoolers. And she asked them to design it. And she had a great experience with them. And I think, they were really engaged. They were, they felt like people were really listening to them, and they're starting to implement the ideas that they came up with. So I think, yes, there's no reason that they can't. And we've also had companies come to us and say, could you design something for our summer interns? Because we would like them to come in with this set of skills. Often those students are, well, maybe they're 19, but they're not much older.
Yeah. Juliet, you have a question.
Yeah, I'm wondering what do you do if you are an external consultant working with a client, and you develop a framing question that really requires linking and leveraging perspectives across the organization and including everyone, but your client is afraid to do that. It seems risky, and they would rather keep it within their own team and just work, within the confines of their own team and develop the solution, even though the solution really has stakeholders that include truly the whole organization. What do you do in that situation?
I hate to say the answer is it depends, but it depends a little bit. Sometimes we will say to a group like that, why don't we work with your team on something else? And you can kind of experience this way of working together, and then let's talk about broadening the group out. So sometimes we'll do that. You can also, it's designed for, this is why the skill 10 is nudging, connecting. It's designed so you can bring new people in later. You can bring new people in at any point. So sometimes, we can say, well, we can start with this group. We want you to be open to bringing other people in because you're going to discover that you need assets that you don't have. And we're going to need to figure out how to connect people who do have those assets. Because believe it or not, you actually don't have all the assets you need. If you're looking at a really complex challenge, you don't have the assets you need.
Yes. Thank you. That was great.
We have teed up our course very much to sort of do this exploration around mindset and methods. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could just illuminate how much does mindset and method play in the way strategic doing is presented and what's your feeling about the mindset and the method part? How would you separate them in your mind?
Well, I think certain parts of it are definitely, I think the appreciative question is a mindset thing. It's because it's really, it's kind of a growth mindset thing, right? It's, to be able to see opportunity and not dwell on the problem. Probably the same thing is true with assets. Do you have a mindset to sort of, imagine something that doesn't exist yet? There are other parts of it that are much, I think as you go through, they become much more sort of methody. Again, that's that kind of that S curve. As you get into, you're not thinking up something new so much anymore. You're starting to optimize what already exists. That's much more kind of a method sort of challenge. The trick for a lot of organizations is that it's that S curve thing, that if you are in a company that needs to hop S curves, you tend to have a lot of people who are good at optimizing and not so good at, who don't have the mindset to think about what could be next.
Yeah,
That's a real challenge.
Larry, you have a question.
Mine goes back to this notion on assets and how do you make certain that one, you have access to all of the assets, or convince those that may not be wanting to embrace the Agile concept that their assets are still important and are needed to succeed in that process. And so where do you go with something like that?
So it's always amazing to me that even if everybody if you have a group of, let's say, 8 people around a table and everybody only has 1 or 2 that they're willing to put out there, that's always enough to get started. It's amazing to me. I mean, we've never, ever had a group where even if people only put 2 things in, where we sort of looked at each other and said, well, there's nothing we can do with that. Mm-hmm. There's always enough. And as people work together and trust each other, they always have more assets and they just may be holding them back. And that's okay. You kind of have to respect that. But often as they get to trust one another, they're like, actually, I had this other thing I didn't mention before. It's like, great. We welcome it, but I think you have to start with where people are and you accept that the assets that they're willing to share as, gifts to the group. But there's always enough to get started, even if you only have a few things.
Wayne, you have a question?
Yeah, Liz, my question is related to scaling. One of the great things about what you're doing is you can apply at any level, right? And any manager can use those techniques. But suppose you want to really look into scale, you want to create an agile organization. How do you move from kind of the tactical level to the more strategic enterprise level? Any techniques? I mean, you just kind of continue to deploy it and let it work by itself, or do you have any strategies around kind of?
Yeah, no, there are ways to do it, and this is I think our next book probably. There are ways to do it, and the key structure you need to have in place is what we call a core team. And the core team isn't so much a work team as the core team is thinking about what does the network need. Does the network have the resources it needs to take advantage of opportunities that they identify? Does the network need assets that it doesn't have that core team can go out and get? Are there barriers that the people in the core team can get out of the way? The core team also kind of, if there's several different action teams working on things in the organization, the core team is responsible to make sure that they aren't working at cross purposes. So there are ways to kind of organize the work, but the really key structure is making sure you have a core team
who would be on the core team? Who would be the members?
So usually there's a person that we call the CDO, the Chief Doing Officer. And some people like calling that the nudger in chief, the person that really likes nudging, which most of us don't.
Not nagging, but nudging, right? You're saying?
Yeah, it's nudging. It's not nagging, it's nudging. And then often the teams that are doing the work fall into a couple different themes. Like in a company, it might be, there's one working on talent, and there's one working on innovation, and then there's one working on, I don't know what, supporting infrastructure maybe. And you need to make sure on the core team you have somebody that's involved in each of those, because that's sort of your channel of communication to those. And then sometimes there's, someone who, there's a person, the financial person maybe is there. And in a nonprofit organization, often there's a fundraising person there, because they're the people who are there to listen for what can I go out and raise money for.
Liz, in the book, there's a good reference a number of times to the way in which people meet to do agile work. And there's a number of situations where, you're advocating for changing the dynamics of that meeting and having them occur briefly. Can you give us some insight into how important is this aspect of meeting, and how can leaders construct meetings meaningfully to make things really move along?
Well, and what a meeting means has changed considerably in the last 12 months, hasn't it? Yes. I think, if we could change our culture of meetings at most of our organizations, that would be, that should be in our obituary as one of the biggest achievements we've ever made. Honestly, I think the skill 8 is a really critical one, that if at every meeting you walked out the door with everybody having something to do with a deliverable and a deadline, that would revolutionize the way most of us do work together. We're just so used to a habit of having a meeting and then walking out and just kind of like, let's see, what did we just do? Not sure exactly, but just that skill all by itself would really change the way we work. And I think in a couple, one, things would just move forward, but I think the other thing that's really important is that it signals to everybody that there are no observers. You don't just get to take up a chair. If you're here, you're going to contribute. And that would also, for most meetings, be an enormous change.
Yeah. Larry, you have a follow-up question. Go ahead.
One of my favorite skills is skill 7, because I have absolutely no patience with inertia. And yet that one talks about starting slow to go fast, but to go. And who decides how slow, who decides how fast, and who decides to go?
So we have a checklist. I think it's in the book, of things that make good starting projects, and we're pretty rigorous about that. That you make sure it fits kind of that checklist of something fast and takes everybody, helps you check your assumptions, hopefully builds up some buzz. But in some ways, it almost doesn't matter what you do as long as you do something. It's kind of one of those, particularly if it's a new group that's coming together to collaborate together in ways that they haven't before. In some ways, it almost doesn't matter as long as you get something done. Because you learn if you can trust each other. If there's dead weight, you figure out who it is, and you don't trust them with anything anymore. So in some ways, it's just that you do something, but it can be really, really, really tiny. So I don't think this is in the book. This is one of my favorite starting projects ever. So I did some work with the University of Puerto Rico, and they wanted to have their business and engineering students work together on new ventures, so startups. And so they wanted to design a course that brought business students and engineering students together in their senior year. But it's really hard at university to get a new course through, really hard. And so that was not an appropriate starting project. But what they could do is they had someone in the group who, this was an asset, they had someone who knew the registrar really well. And so they went to the registrar and said, if we put the senior capstone engineering course and the senior business course, could you schedule those at the same time in rooms right next to each other? The registrar said, I guess we could do that. And all of a sudden they had they spent the next semester piloting a course because they had the 2 classrooms right next to each other, and they could mix them up in student groups. That was a tiny, tiny, tiny starting project, but it has turned into this enormous sort of innovation ecosystem project in Puerto Rico.
It's like small interventions have outsized effect.
Yeah, it was so small. I remember when they told me that was their starting project, like, really? Something that little? And they're like, yeah. Yeah.
Jesse, you have a question.
Sure, Liz, good evening. This question is actually about my classmate, Larry. Larry's running a Agile project that's really, really interesting. But anyway, he has customers at 3 different levels of the organization that he has to consider. And as it pertains to skill 6, which is identifying sort of the measurable outcomes and metrics for success, how might he balance, the customer prioritizing or finding ways to deliver the right measurable outcomes for each level of the customers?
Yeah. Skill 6, when we talk about metrics, in some ways, people get this one confused, I would say. So for those of us who are used to thinking in terms of KPIs or metrics, or, we write evaluation plans, or we live in that world, that we're thinking of metrics as kind of an accountability measure, right? That's the way they get used in our world, generally speaking. And in skill 6, we're not using them in that way. What we're using them for is to make sure that everybody sees success the same way. Because if we can get to the point where we all agree on a metric, whether or not we're actually going to start using that metric, if we can't agree that that would be the metric to measure success, then we know that we're looking at the same thing when we're talking about success. It's really about alignment. It's not about accountability. It's really, but for those of us who live in, I used to be a grant writer, and, so I was always writing evaluation plans, and it was really hard for me to kind of wrap my head around, this isn't that. There is a place for accountability, but it's not there, right? It should be in a different conversation, I think.
Jeremy,
I know that doesn't exactly give you the answer you wanted, Larry or Jesse, but.
That was wonderful for me. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Larry might be thinking, wait a minute, you're not helping me talk to my three.
Yeah, he put his thumbs up. I think he liked the answer.
All Larry's got to do is align it. Just right. That's all you got to do, Larry. You got it.
Jeremy, you have a question.
Hey, Liz. Happy Wednesday. Hey. Thank you for speaking to our class.
I'm delighted to.
I think skill 9 is very important, but is often overlooked in practice. Yes. Meetings are used to provide status updates, but rarely spend time to review the underlying plan. So my question is, how can you encourage reflective learning in an organization, especially if the culture tends to favor blame instead of learning from mistakes?
Yeah, so I think, so it really rests on the success of skill 8, I think. So if you use skill 8 rigorously, where everybody who has something to do has a deliverable, and you make sure that that deliverable is shared before you get to that follow-up meeting. So that follow-up meeting is not about reporting on, this is what I did. So it's not that. Then you can use that meeting as a conversation to say, we're not going to go around the table and everybody's going to give the blow by blow of what they did. Instead, people are going to say, here's what I learned while I was doing what I said I was going to do. And in that case, the only people that get blamed, and I think this is appropriate, is the people who didn't do what they said they would do. You know, Ed likes to say he thinks there's research to be done on the positive power of ostracism. That it's appropriate for people to maybe feel blamed if they didn't do what they said they would do. But otherwise, I think if you can set up skill 8 right, you can spend skill 9, the 30-30 meeting, talking about, well, what did you learn? Because that's not about blame. That's just about what did we learn that maybe is going to help us reassess our assumptions.
Good answer. Xiao, you had a question?
For me, like, I'm pretty curious about the skill 3. Like, while I was considering like when to identify the people's asset, and including the hidden ones, were mainly in the beginning was framing the right questions, like what kind of questions, or from what aspect to ask those questions is better to to have a more invitational conversation for people to to more comfortable to share with their just how to do this step more like in a better way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, one thing I like to do, my colleagues probably all do it differently, but when I start an asset conversation, I'll usually say, here's our framing question. Then I'll say, what isn't everybody's, and if I can, I'll actually tell people this ahead of time, like in an email. I'll say, here's what I want to talk about. So think about it before you get here. But I'll say, why doesn't everybody take a couple of minutes just quietly thinking on their own about what assets they think they have that might help us answer the framing question. You don't have to know exactly how, but you think they might have something to contribute, and give everybody a couple of minutes to think quietly. And then we're going to go around the table or around the Zoom screen or whatever, right? And everybody just mention 1 or 2. And it does a couple of things. First of all, it sort of honors the people who are more introverted, so that they know they're going to get asked, but they have a chance to think about it, so they're not being caught by surprise. If you say everybody just mentioned 1 or 2, then you stop the talker from saying, let me tell you about the 25 assets I have. Like, I don't want to know about the 25. I want to know 1 or 2. And if we have time, we'll come back and you can tell us about some of the rest of them. So that kind of creates that sort of equity of voice that we talk about with safe space.
Right. That's very helpful. Like, after reading the strategic doing, like it's very altered my mind. Like, before, I was very hierarchical thinking. Like, I was always considering, like, for the leader as myself, I should come out all the solutions for whole team. But now I'm doing a new project, so I'm thinking, to let now I do have lots of problems want to solve, and it's very complex. So I'm thinking to want to have all the board to join in and to contribute their asset. And so I'm wondering, what's the best way to start? And your question and your answer totally answered that.
Okay,
thank you.
Good, thank you.
Wayne, you have a question?
Yes, Liz. a lot of the students here are mid-level to more senior level, and they all want to kick some butt in organizations, but they're and I don't want to speak for the people, but they're frustrated, and so I'm looking at doing kind of an accelerator, some kind of ramping up something that has any examples of people who've done that, who've embraced these concepts, maybe not all of them, maybe one or two, and really flown up and really blown an organization up and really succeeded. So
well, actually, that University of Puerto Rico example is one. So the guy who was the team lead there was a professor of chemical engineering, and they created the university he's at is at the far end of the island. It's not San Juan, it's the far end of the island, and but they created such an amazing sort of entrepreneurship thing happening in that town that he's now the vice president of the system, because they saw what he was doing and said, we want to do this on the whole island. Come be the vice president. It meant he had to stop looking like a professor, and now he wears suits and had to get his hair cut. But I think, it's a good trade. But we've had a number of people like that who, I think it can be a little tricky, because I can also tell you about people who, started doing something and got called in by their supervisor, whatever, is saying, wait a minute, what are you doing? I didn't tell you could do that. But I think for people who figure out how to kind of thread the needle on that, generally results kind of speak for themselves. And I think often people will come say, how did you get that done? And particularly if you're able to do it in strategic doing is designed to be a pretty short timeline, right? It's like, how did you get it done so quickly? And then I think you can say, well, here's some things I've learned about that are different ways of working together.
Yeah. Are there any one or two that you would combine to really accelerate, that make you see kind of, I'm looking like the flywheel concept to really kind of take off and use this to really, maybe I'm not thinking incrementally, I guess, maybe, but.
It's all of them in some ways, right? That's how we started, was with all of them together, and then we kind of broke it apart. So, but I think some of them, I think the appreciative question, I think, is one that can completely change conversations. It's the one that I had the hardest time with. I think a number of us, I don't know what fields all of you are in, but some fields, like if any of you are engineers, you are trained to be people who see problems and solve them, and to avoid risk, right? You don't want the bridge to fall apart or whatever it is, right? So it's really a mindset shift. And but I think many of us, just in general, we got promoted in our careers because we were good at solving problems. And so then we see problems. But being able to kind of flip that and see the opportunity and help other people see the opportunity, I think can really unlock all kinds of amazing things happening. So I think that one's really key. And then I think the last one, or the ninth one, actually, having 30-30 meetings, just that stay at it. No matter what, even if everybody can't be there every 30 days or 14 days or whatever it is. I think a lot of us, have started projects, they start great guns and then they kind of fall off because it just gets pushed aside by the newest thing. But, my colleague Janyce at the university, she moved to the Shoals in 2014, and the chamber recruited her onto a group to talk about improving that part of the world. And that group has met together every 30 or 60 days. They've changed over time since 2014. But that area has really changed, but they just kept at it. It didn't matter if they were all there. They just kept at it.
Interesting.
Brigitte, you have a question.
Just one more. I feel as though we spend a lot of time talking about how we as individuals can take these skills and use them and excel at some and not others. One of the things that I struggle with the most is the concept of sustainability and almost succession planning. And if we all end up being the individuals and organizations that are the champions for this, but don't intend to be there in perpetuity, how do you bridge the gap between being the champion and, creating that environment and that space and having success with ensuring that it happens after you leave?
Yeah, I think one of the things we advise people to do is to always be looking for your apprentice. who's the person you can bring along, because there's nothing, you read the book, there's nothing magic about it, so there's no reason you can't say to someone, we're going to talk about assets today. I want you to listen to how we have the conversation. And next time we have that conversation, would you be up for leading that conversation? There's nothing magic that other people can't do, but it's really important and I think there's two reasons why you might want to be looking for an apprentice. One is you might leave and somebody needs to be able to step in your shoes. But the other thing is, if you're working on a complex challenge that's going to require an expanding network, you're going to need more leadership capacity than just you. Even if you're still there, you're going to, you need some other people who are able to have these different kinds of conversations.
Liz, a number of our folks here have put their framing question in the chat.
Yeah.
I wonder if you'll give us some reflections on what you see there.
Sure. Let's see. A few of them look too long, but you know that. The how might we is an interesting, we had a conversation on our team about this the other day, about whether or not how might we was a good start to a framing question. And I'm okay with it. My colleague, Janyce, says that she really prefers imagine if, because she feels like how might we heads people into a sort of a problem-solving mode too soon. And that with the framing question, you want to keep it big and open and helping people see the future, rather than to immediately say, what tool can I apply to this? Take that for what it's worth. I don't mind it so much. Janyce really has an issue with it. How might we develop and manufacture medicines that meet society's needs? I think that's a great question. How might we adapt higher education practices to reflect the changes that occurred over the last year into the beyond? It's certainly one that almost every university is asking, I think. I think that it's the right substance of a question, but it doesn't have the, one of the things that a good framing question has is that kind of that emotional sort of tug that makes people go, oh yes, I really care about that. And that one doesn't quite have that. This is one where I think the adjectives and verbs suggestion might help, because that one doesn't really have any adjectives. So there might be some. And maybe, adapt, you could maybe change that verb into, revolutionize or, whatever. I think you could probably strengthen that verb as well. How might we develop a versatile approach to corporate fundraising? A development person, near and dear to my heart. It's the right question. It is verging, though, and you know your audience better than I do. The topic is verging on a technical one, right? I mean, the question is that really a conversation where we don't know where we're really breaking new ground, where, or is it one where, well, there are best practices, we just have to figure out which ones we would use? I don't know. Although I will say that there are a number of groups we've worked with over this last year that have had to think about how do we do fundraising in a completely different way, because we can't sit down with people face to face. How might we create an effective and resonant call to act? Resonant is a very good adjective, thank you. Call to action for employees to diversify their networks and drive referrals for underrepresented communities in a way that is sustainably inspiring. There's a lot of good stuff there. It's just long, I think. So, do some surgery and get it down to 25 words. You don't need to put everything in the question. You don't have to throw everything at it. I think it's a little bit like vision statements sometimes when you first start out writing a framing question, that everybody wants like their little corner on how they see things in the question, and before you know it, you've of something big. But then I think you have to do surgery and figure out how to get just those parts that make everybody go yes, yes. One of the things we like to say is it's an invitation to conversation, and it needs to be something that makes people want to come to the party. If it feels like you're inviting them to a meeting, it's not the right question. And this, Brigitte is more that it's so much a framing question. Yeah. Let's see what else we got down here. How might we create an ideal global corporate culture that allows for local adaptation? Without knowing what your organization is, I think I would probably, there might be something that would make it feel more like the organization.
Yeah. So we could build this around like our leadership behaviors, or our we're a medical dermatology company.
Okay.
So we could probably tie it around some of those the strategic messaging that we have.
Yeah.
For sure.
This might be one where you could flip too to the, it's something about the patients,
Yeah. Because patient focus. So one of the key skills or focus areas is keeping the patient at the heart of what we do.
Yeah.
So maybe I can build it into that. It's like, how might we create an ideal global corporate culture while keeping the patient at the heart of what we do and allowing for local adaptation?
Yeah, keep working
Something
on
it. I'll keep working on it.
Keep massaging, yeah.
Massage. Give it a back rub.
Yep.
This is a Twitter for framing questions.
Right.
255 characters. You have to fit it into that message.
That's right. Yeah. This is a skill that I just feel like you can never practice this one enough. I mean, we just got to. So we do a monthly 1 hour call. It's called Third Thursday. You're all welcome to be there. You can come to strategicdoing.net and sign up for a newsletter, and you'll get notices about it. But we do a different topic every month. And somebody the other day just asked me, they've been doing this for like 5 years, and they said, could we do a Third Thursday just on practicing framing questions? So,
Question is, where is it going from here? I mean, we have our 10 skill sets. Does it stay there, or do you see it evolving, or do those steps evolve somehow, or where do we go from where we are?
Yeah. So, 5 years ago, we didn't have the 10, we just had the 4. So never say never. There's pieces of it that have definitely changed over time. The most recent change is probably in skill 8 to put the deliverable in, because we realized that without a solid deliverable, it was still a little bit too slippery, and people would, not quite do what they said they would do. So, it is continually evolving. We try to keep it as sort of open source as we can, and people experiment with different parts of it, and try to find new ways to do things. We're also doing a lot of thinking and having a lot of conversations about is it truly cross-cultural? Are there cultures in which it is better suited? Are there ways in which maybe it needs to adapt for some other cultures? And those are interesting conversations. We've done quite a bit of work. Flint is one of the places where we've done lots of work. So we've, they give us lots of feedback about what does this look like in a predominantly African-American context. Puerto Rico is a different cultural context. We have a lot of people in Canada using it in a francophone kind of place. And the Canadians are also really interested in thinking about First Nations and how does this align or not align with those particular cultural sort of touchstones.
Speaking of a very different cultural context, sorry, Steve, I didn't clear this one, but I spent a number of years in the United States Marine Corps, and I was wondering if any Agile methodologies were ever attempted or adopted by the U.S. military or other militaries, and in what capacity, and how did they succeed, hopefully?
Yes, we have. So I was not on this project, but my colleagues Ed and Scott were with the Army. And I think the most interesting part of that conversation was for them to talk about what would psychological safety look like. And they had this long conversation about, in particular, should people wear uniforms to those meetings? Because that right there, it's like, literally, you wear it on your sleeve, right? The hierarchy is right there, and they decided that for those conversations that nobody would wear a uniform. People would be in civilian dress for those conversations so that they could have, what happened outside that room was one thing, but inside the room where they're trying to do innovative thinking, linking, leveraging assets, everybody's got assets civilian clothes, no uniforms. So we have, and there's somebody actually in our certification course right now who's with the Navy, I think. he's also having to think that through because it does look different. And, you can't, you're not going in there saying, we got to turn, there's absolutely a place for the hierarchy, so, but how do you work within that and find places to carve out a space for a different kind of conversation?
Liz, we shared with you yesterday, the now prep call, the discovery of our 4-leader model that goes along with this. We talked about it being a diagnostician and decider, an agent of change, an implementer of action, and a reflective learner. And those things came to us from the reading of the book and sort of reading between the lines of what goes on behind the scenes to make these things happen. Could you just give us, we'd like some feedback from you. Does that seem a good addition to this? And do those leaders archetypes seem realistic?
Yes. And I think, which ones of those come to the fore depends on the context in which someone's working.
Right.
Some of them are needed more in some organizations at sometimes than others. I think all of us view ourselves very much as reflective practitioners. That we are not, we're in a university, but we try really hard not to be academics first. We're practicing and then we're reflecting on what we're seeing as we practice and how can we describe that? How can we, dig into the research to find out, what helps explain this thing that we keep seeing happening, So, but yeah, I think it makes sense as a sort of set of archetypes for the way leaders use their skills.
Yeah, it's definitely a sort of a non-linear approach to the leading. It's sort of contextualized around the work, and it's just a way of recognizing what stage you might be in a particular point in the work.
Yeah. And I don't think it's it's not as if you start at when you're an entry-level worker, you're one thing, and then you kind of I don't think it's that. I think it's just what does the situation require of you at a particular time.
Yeah. That's what we call it a GPS, because again, a given project, you're in different roles, right? And that would require you to use different doing skills as part of that. So just a tool to use.
Yeah, and I think what the some organizations grab onto this very quickly, and it's there isn't an issue with sort of people in the hierarchy feeling threatened. Other organizations, it's very different, and it's much more of a sort of a guerrilla tactic, for lack of a better word. And that's different. That requires different kinds of skills, I think.
Well, as we've come to the top of the hour, it's been a fascinating conversation with you so quickly. Can't believe the hour has gone so rapidly. I just wonder if there's any other piece of advice or wisdom you might pass on to us as we all go on our individual journeys to implement strategic doing in our own work. Give us one piece of great advice that we could all carry forward.
So I think, it was terrific when you all reached out that you had been reading the book, and it's been a delight to be with you. But I just want to say there's a whole community of people all over the globe that are using these skills, and we would love to have as many of you kind of part of that conversation as would like to be. There's lots of ways you can do that. And one of them is this Thursday gathering, and that's open to anybody. You can invite anybody you want to be part of that. The one in April is on social network analysis and how that connects to strategic doing. But there's a whole community of people to meet and to get to know, and that's why I love what I do. I enjoy seeing change happen in organizations, but mostly I get to work with really cool people doing really cool things all over the world. Right. And that's just a lot of fun. So please come join us. It's a fun party. We have an annual conference as well. So, that's also a place to kind of connect with the community.
Yeah, if you send us that information, we'll put it on our Canvas site so that everybody gets to know what the sequencing is. And as much of the calendars you have around that would be good. If you could send those over to us, we'll make sure everybody gets to see that.
Sure. I'm going to put on the website in the chat, and people can just go ahead and here. But yeah, and also just feel free to send me an email or connect with me on LinkedIn or whatever. I'm always happy to. These are the kind of conversations that are a lot of fun for me.
Yeah. So. Well, I want to thank you for being so open and for sharing your knowledge so graciously, and for coming tonight to our class. It's been a real pleasure and honor to have you with us. We look forward to continuing the conversation and look forward to the next book that will be a complement to strategic.
Yeah, we've got to get it done. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you.
I just said that out loud. We're writing one. Yeah. Okay. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My guest today was Liz Nilsen, Senior Program Director of the Purdue Agile Strategy Lab. This has been a Learning Aloud podcast from the Organizational Dynamics community at the University of Pennsylvania. My thanks to Dan Shields for producing today's show. My name is Steve Hart.